Thank you for joining me today. Some selected Psalms. Today we are in Psalm 137. It is a psalm that is called imprecatory. Imprecatory means that it is a psalm that wants God to rain down judgment upon the enemy. What the scenario is that back about 600 years before Jesus came into this world, the Jewish people lived in their land, and they were sinning against God, not being good Jews at all. And God used the Babylonian Empire to bring judgment upon Israel's sins, the Jewish people's sins. And so they conquered Israel and took them captive back to Babylon. And so this psalm is set in the scene of the Jewish people, about 7,000 plus of them, that were taken captive by the Babylonian Empire back to Babylonia, where they were held captive in a pagan land, away from their temple, unable to sacrifice animals or worship like they used to in their temple. So that's the scenario of this psalm. It's a very sad condition. And it seems like the Jewish people eventually repented of their sin and God restored them into their land. But what we look at in Psalm 137 is that they are in this foreign land, taken by their conquerors, and in essence being punished for their sinful behavior. And this psalm is something that they would pray or that they would sing back to God to say, God, we want you to bring justice and judgment on our enemies. Now, you have to remember that war back in Bible times was very cruel. I mean, it's bad now, but it was worse then. The Assyrians were cruel, the Babylonians were cruel, and whenever another empire overtook another land, it was devastating. Many times they just tried to wipe out their enemy completely. So this is a prayer of justice, of judgment, and it must be interpreted by what the scenario is, about what the circumstances are. With that kind of revelation and understanding, you have to interpret it in the times that it was written, not in our times. We are hopefully a little more civilized even in our battles, but sometimes I fear not. So this psalm is really talking about a sense of justice. And there's a lot of emotions in this psalm. Even though it's just a few verses, 9 verses, there's a lot of emotions expressed in this psalm. There's sorrow, there's devotion, there's loyalty. They are living in a land of captivity, away from their temple, away from Jerusalem, away from what they are knowing as home. And so there's a lot of pain and distress in this psalm. So let's pick it up in verse 1. Beside the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept as we thought of Jerusalem. So this is a psalm of exile. They're remembering back home, and so they're longing for home. You might say they are homesick. And so verses 1 and 2 is a passion for home and the pain of the memories of back home. We put away our harps, hanging them on the branches of poplar trees. What they're saying in a poetic way is that we can't sing the songs of back home because we're too far away and our hearts are in pain, in agony. It's kind of like saying, because of grief in my life, I'm hanging up my guitar and I'm not going to play anymore. It's the pain and the agony of grief and the losing of what they knew as home. So you might say that the writer is writing a melancholy type of psalm. The joyful songs are not being sung. The pain and the memories of back home were aching at their hearts. They were weeping, they were crying. Then, to add to their pain of the loss of their homeland, we find the scorn of the Babylonians. So when we read verse 3 and verse 4, we read it with a sense of sarcasm or cruelty or ridicule or scorn or scoffing. Notice verse 3 and verse 4. Our captors demanded a song from us. Our tormentors insisted on a joyful hymn. Sing us one of those songs of Jerusalem. What the Babylonians are saying is, where is your God that you sing about now? We have overcome you and taken you captive into our land. Where is your God now? Sing your songs of praise and worship now. So it's a song of ridicule. So it's a statement of ridicule. The captors were ridiculing the Jewish people, poking fun at the Jews, so to speak, in verse 3 and verse 4. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a pagan land? Their hearts are broken. So in verse 1 and 2, we see the passion for their homeland, the pain of the memories. And then verses 3 and 4, we see the poking fun by the Babylonians toward the Jewish people to sing their songs of their Lord in a pagan land. And they just couldn't bring themselves to do that. Their hearts were broken. And so we find these verses here in verses 3 and 4, the scorn of the Babylonians, taunting them, amusing themselves by poking fun at the Jewish people. Notice verse 5 and verse 6. This is the writer's pledge of loyalty to his homeland and to the temple of worship. This pledge of loyalty is seen in verse 5 and verse 6. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget how to play the harp. May my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I fail to remember you, if I don't make Jerusalem my greatest joy. Kind of like saying, we're going to remember our homeland. We're going to remember this tragedy. We're going to remember this. We won't forget where we really belong. We don't belong here. In a metaphoric way, we can relate to that in our spiritual journey. We're just passing through this land. We have a home beyond the sky, and we're strangers in this strange land, and we're homesick. We want to go home. And so we find ourselves with that innate hope of heaven and eternity in our souls. Well, here in verses 3, 4, and 5, and 6, we find these verses that speak with so much emotion. This loyalty that's been pledged by the writer to his homeland. And then we come to verse 7 through 9. In verses 7 through 9, we have some harsh language. By harsh, I mean it's not language that is usually used in Scripture. We like to talk about the love of God, the grace of God, the forgiveness that He offers, the mercy that He brings into our lives, forgiving us of our sins and granting us new life and a hope of eternity. We like to talk about those things. But here we find these verses 7 through 9 talking about justice, about judgment. God had used the Babylonians to bring judgment upon the sinful Jews. But now that they're in this pagan land, away from their homeland, they're praying that God will bring judgment upon the Babylonians. They're longing for Zion. They want to go back to Jerusalem. And they are asking God to bring judgment upon the Babylonians so these Jewish people can go back to Jerusalem. Notice in verses 7 through 9, we find a prayer for justice or judgment. O Lord, remember what the Edomites did on the day the armies of Babylon captured Jerusalem. What did the Edomites do? The Edomites did not help the Jewish people at all. Matter of fact, they encouraged the Babylonians to take the Jewish people captive. And we read about this in Obadiah chapter 1, verses 10 through 15. And so they are asking God through this psalm to judge the Edomites for their complacency, for their lack of help of the Jewish people. And on the day the armies of Babylon captured Jerusalem, we also pray, he says here, for judgment upon the Babylonians. Destroy it, they yelled. Level it to the ground. Bring it to its foundations. And so the Edomites had taken no active part in the destruction of the city, but they had rejoiced in its destruction and the captivity of the Jewish people into the Babylonian land. The Edomites were cheering on the Babylonians to wipe out the Jewish people. They were saying, bring it to the ground, lay it bare, tear it down to its foundations. And so we find that in Obadiah chapter 1 as well. Then these words here in verse 8. O Babylon, you will be destroyed. Happy is the one who pays you back, or blessed is the one who pays you back for what you have done to us. Happy is the one who takes your babies and smashes them against the rocks. Now, for our ears, this is kind of rough to hear. But this is what the Babylonians had done to the Jewish people when they overran them and took them captive. They killed people without discrimination. The enemy, this psalm is praying, will get what it has given. The enemy will reap what it has sown. Disregard for human life that was practiced in the ancient warfare and the total extermination of an entire enemy was a part of normal ancient warfare. None of this was shocking to them. But they pray, God, what they have done to us, may you do to them. Let no one be spared. What Babylon had done to Jerusalem was to be done to Babylon. And so we close out this psalm with some harsh language. But I think there's some lessons here for us. When Jesus comes on the scene, he talks a message of reconciliation and grace. He says to the Jewish people, you have heard it said that you should love your brother but hate your enemy. But I say to you that you ought to love your enemies. And so as much as possible, as much that lies within us, we ought to be exemplifying love, mercy, and grace and forgiveness in our relationships to one another. Now, of course, we're reading this psalm in the light of what happened on October 7th to the Jewish people and the destruction of Hezbollah and Hamas by the Jewish government. We can see this actually taking place in our day, where judgment and justice would come upon the enemies of God's people. And so there is a place in the world where nations must protect themselves, just like America. In our life and time, in America, we have not had our nation ravaged and been taken into captivity. We're far enough away from many of our enemies that we find few attacks, but a couple of times we've come close. We think of Pearl Harbor and we think of 9/11. And we can understand the words of this psalm in light of Pearl Harbor and in light of 9/11. Just like we say each September, we remember, we will not forget. This psalm is saying with the Jewish voice, we remember our homeland. we will not forget what has been done to us. And we can bring it over 2,000 years now into our present day with the Jewish people, and where the Jewish people find themselves attacked by every side. Their enemies often want to wipe them off the map. We can understand this imprecatory, this lament, this heartfelt, passionate prayer to God, for God to bring justice to the world, for God to bring judgment to our enemies. So an interesting psalm, one that you won't often find preached about, but a psalm nonetheless that's in our Bibles that brings about the interesting contrast of pain, judgment, and passion. May our hearts, especially in our relationships with others, be filled with peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Jesus said in Matthew 5, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God." What he means by that is God is a God of peace ultimately. He brings peace to our hearts. He brings peace to our relationships. And he brings inner peace. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God." What he means by that is that his children ought to exemplify the peace that he offers. When I put God in proper relationship in my life, when I put him on the throne of my heart, he brings peace between me and him through the cross of Christ. I have peace with God through Jesus Christ when I put God on the throne room of my heart. But it's not only peace with God, but it's inner peace as well. Peace of mind. The Bible talks about that kind of peace that passes all understanding, where I can bring my worries, my cares, my problems to God in prayer, and he can give me peace of mind, inner peace. But it's not only peace with God, and it's not only the peace of God in my heart, but it's also peace with one another. We are to be peacemakers in our corner of the world. If there's relationships out of whack, may God help you to bring peace as much as lies within you. Now, sometimes we try to make peace and the other person doesn't want peace with us. And God understands that. But after we've done all that we can, we leave the rest with God. Well, this is part of the selected Psalms that we have been looking at. It's one that probably won't be preached a lot from pulpits, but it's still an interesting psalm. May God bless you, and thank you for joining me today.